Hello everyone, welcome to my new video of I made a Fibre Glass Computer Case. So here are some pictures of the finished product 2 years later. I had to replace a power supply that failed in it, and so I thought I'd do a video showing the teardown and replacement of that. You'll actually see more of that video footage near the end of this video, but here is some shots that show you exactly how it turned out, plus a bit of dust that it gathered over the last 2 years. The inspiration for the colors on this came from the motherboard that I got from a friend for free. He was getting rid of some old computer stuff, and by old I mean it's old. This gigabyte style of motherboard obviously was around a fair bit, around I think 2008 through to whenever they decided it wasn't cool anymore, with the blue and white coloring, as well as the heat sinks on this motherboard were that dark blue with the white racing stripes. I guess they could be called the GT racing stripe. So yeah, when I was given I selected the motherboard from a range of computer stuff that my friend was getting rid of. I saw it, thought it looked pretty cool. It had a chip with it. All I had to do was get some RAM, and yeah, it's fairly old, but that was the inspiration for the outcome. I was just aiming to do some kind of computer case, and it would carry on that theme. So here's how it looked just after I did the clear coat, and that was the last steps in the painting and clear coat process. And yeah, just thought I'd show that at the beginning of the film so that you can see where this case would end up. At this stage, I had no idea what the end product was gonna look like. I just started tearing down an old computer case. Right here I'm adding some rivets to stabilize that section, because I knew if I made this cut, certain parts of the design, well, basically there was no support for certain sections, and some of the parts would just come apart, and I wanted to just maintain the form that it had if I was gonna, during the teardown process. I use this Dremel style tool with a cutting wheel. These cutting wheels aren't probably the right type for metal work, but because they would wear away fairly quickly, some of these cuts required maybe 2 wheels, like they just wear away and shrink down to a very small disc. So later on you might see some small discs being used. That's just because they're they're just worn out and about to be replaced. Everywhere that I made a cut on this case, I had to file back and sand the edges so that later on I wouldn't cut myself, because this tool would, leave some fairly sharp edges. Right here on the video is where I had no idea what I was gonna do. I'd made the first cut just to take the power supply mount away from the orientation that it was in, and yeah, here you can see me just the cogs turning in my head of where I was going to go with the next part of the modification. But in general, I was just aiming to get this as low profile as I could. I knew it was going to be a horizontal case rather than a tower mounted form factor. Possibly that was my inclination, because the first computer I ever got was just a horizontal case, and the monitor would sit on top of the case. That's how some of the computers were just designed from probably earlier than that, from the early days of computers, IBM compatible computers, to when people realized that because of heat movement within a case, that it was best to have a tower so that all the heat would just keep rising up away from the motherboard, whereas if you had a horizontal motherboard, hot heat could maybe get trapped underneath it. So yeah, that's why we know today that the best form factor is a tower with the motherboard in a horizontal position for that reason. But yeah, I know that computers don't have to be in that form factor, only if you're going for ultimate cooling. And this being a media PC and not a gaming PC, that didn't matter to me. Plus I was using an old motherboard with an old chip. It was the first generation i7. This motherboard was probably from 2009, I think it was. And I had similar hardware with it, such as the graphics card was a 4 gigabyte, maybe a 2 gigabyte 3D card from that period. So partly this, in my mind, this was going to be a period piece, but with a highly customized case. And I also designed it with future proofing, and due to the micro nature of it, I just accepted that every motherboard that would come in the future would be a micro ATX, because there's no room for anything larger. And I know the micro ATX form factor motherboard's never going to go anywhere. So basically, where we're at with the build that you see, I was just wasn't trying to go wild with the shape. I was just trying to get a basic, rectangular shaped chassis to hold the basic hardware that had to go into it. Motherboard had to have room for the fan and cooling for the motherboard or for the chip. RAM. I knew I was going to use a SSD hard drive, which fairly small, and I knew I could just place it anywhere within the build. And I was not intending on putting any drive bays in it for optical drives, DVD drives, or any of that stuff. So I was just going to keep all of the hardware as minimal as I could. And being a motherboard from 2009, there wasn't going to be any NVMe drive, or the M.2 drive. This plate I made here was to support the bay for the power supply, because I just felt the existing mount was moving a bit, wasn't strong enough. And I actually cut that piece out of the side of the original case, which was made of steel. The age of this case that I cut down, I think it was purchased in 2004, 2005. And I'm pretty sure it was steel, not an aluminium case. But I could be wrong. But just the way that it cut and the way that it feels and how rigid it is, I believe it was steel, whereas most cases these days are made out of aluminium. The angled pieces of I used here were aluminium, just from our regular local hardware store, warehouse type hardware store. And I just knew that rivets was going to be the best way to put this together. So I just went at this with cutting tools, and every join that I was going to make was going to be with a rivet. The switch that you just saw me install was just going to be for the internal lighting. I made an LED strip that was going to be powered from the USB, and for that I actually had to get a USB card where it had a port, a USB socket internal, just because of the source or the connector type that I chose to go with. And that LED strip was 5 volts, so it was pulling just for the 5 volts from the USB socket that I had. That card also had to be an IDE. This motherboard was so old that it did have PCIe for the graphics card, but it was old enough to still have an IDE socket for a hard drive, as well as it had SATA, of course, but it also had the original PCI socket. And so I went with a piece, and for that, where that slot was, I had to get a USB extender card that was PCI. And since, spoiler alert, I've had to replace the motherboard completely just recently, and there's no PCI slot on a new motherboard, so I'm either going to change that USB power for the internal lighting to some other socket that's available inside the board, whether it's straight from the PSU or some other form of connecting it to USB. But I don't really need extra USB ports. The motherboard I have now probably has 7 sockets on the back, and all I need to connect to this media PC in general is a few hard drives and one hard drive plus all the wireless USB keyboard and mouse receivers. A lot of the construction of this section that I'm doing now for the SDE mount, plus all the other connections that I did, was basically with a 4mm drill bit and 4mm rivets. So I just kept it quite simple, and they're definitely going to do the job. I've never heard of rivets popping off without an excessive amount of force put against them. This is the first project I've ever really done with rivets, but I did have experience with rivets back in high school when we did some basic metal work, and folding tin plate steel to make whatever you make in high school metal shop projects. And I'm generally a woodworker, and this is probably the project I've done with the most metal work involved. And I just chose to use rivets, which is a lot like the Meccano system. As a kid, we never had a lot of Meccano. I was more of a Lego boy. We're a Lego family, but I had played with some of my friends Meccano, and this cutting and riveting with L brackets and such just reminded me of that. So if anyone who was good at Meccano could possibly do this type of approach to modifying a computer case. Here I'm using some etching primer because I wanted to paint all of these areas, especially the back, which was a mixture of different metals and sources of metal and aluminium. So I just thought if I use the etching primer, whatever paint I put on it after that would stick, and I wouldn't have any worries about adhesion. I do wish I erased some of those Nico pen markers or magic marker pen markers before I painted, but because some of them are showing through the white paint still. So here's where I'm building the mold for the external case. Basically all I did was take the shape of the chassis that I already had and built around it. So the height of it was just dictated by the height of the chassis I made. Here I'm using string to align the top piece with the bottom piece using right angle set squares to make sure that it was vertically correct. There are better ways, I'm sure, to align that top piece with the bottom piece, but that was the way I chose to approach it, and probably wasted a lot of time doing it, but it served its purpose. And I like to do things my way sometimes. So that was just a test fitting of so I could see where this was going, with the shape of the fabric and how it would stretch around this mold. I actually got this technique, I stole it from the guys that install custom door panels when they're putting in like custom speaker setups in cars. Generally it's in a lot of, you know, classic cars, lowriders. Well, that's the kind of cars that these guys would do. I'm going to share a link to that video in the description so that you can see where this method came from. I didn't invent it, of course. I borrowed it and applied it to computer building or making a computer case. And yeah, basically you make a mold, and that mold is either going to stay in to hold the molding, the end product, or the mold can, if you set it up right, you can remove the mold, or this, you know, like in my case, I kept the top and bottom pieces of MDF here, but that centerpiece completely was just removed in the end product, so I could put the chassis of the computer case into it. So I went to my father for help with the epoxy enamel and fiberglassing, because he all of his life has made model aeroplanes, and probably in the last 30 years he's started to get pretty good at covering wings for the planes with fiberglass and the epoxy resin. So I was really hacking into his stock. I might share some product images of the type of epoxy products he bought here that I used. But yeah, I went to him because I'd never done this before, and he's done it a million times before. So yeah, when you know someone who's an expert at something, you get them involved on your project if you choose to use that method. So here I've slowed down this one piece to real time, so you really get to see how long it takes to put just one piece of fiberglass down. It can be a slow and methodical process. If in general you can just whack it down if you had a lot of epoxy resin mixed up and you needed to get it down quick before the epoxy resin sets or goes off, as they say. Here we were just mixing up little cups, and I was just applying sheet after sheet, and when the cup got empty, Dad would mix up another batch of epoxy resin ready to go. But the method here the main method to keep it flat and wrinkle free is to put a stripe down the middle of your piece and then work your way out from there, just to keep it flat and wrinkle free and keep the fabric just going in the one direction. Because this stuff is a bit of a mesh, it has that, it's not a solid piece, it's a mesh of fiberglass that it can be kind of twisted and turned and stretched and pulled in all sorts of directions. So that's just one challenge you get, and why it can be skewed and you get wrinkles, creases in the fabric. So yeah, with his guidance, I did a pretty good job for my first ever adventure into fiberglassing. This stuff did make me itchy, so maybe if you're gonna get into this, you want to wear some kind of bodysuit, like a painter's suit maybe, just a plastic wrap to keep the fibers out of your clothes fibers and off your skin. The other one would be the epoxy resins. I have heard one lady's experience from working with epoxy resin that she ended up with severe respiratory issues. So always look at, do your investigation into what personal protective equipment you should be wearing when you're using certain types of epoxies. So here's what it looked like at the end of the first round of fiberglassing. At the top there you can see some of the pieces lifted up as the epoxy set. I just had to cut them back and smooth them out and keep going with the further layers to pull that back and make the edges that I wanted and not the edges that the epoxy wanted to fold in. But yeah, the other thing I'll point out is where the edge of the fiberglass frays and you see all that fraying with the epoxy enamel in it, can make those basically become pointy, sharp pieces. So I did stab myself a few times handling this case in that state. And it's basically similar to the back fin of a fish that have a spiky or spiny fin down their back, like a brim. When you run your hand backwards against it, it's just like a bunch of needles poking at you. So here you can see I've trimmed off any edges I didn't want or couldn't have, and I'm sanding flat anything that was too wrinkly and any of the rough edges, and then I just continued with the next layer. So I believe I did the first day on a Saturday, and this second layer that you're seeing now might be the second day. I'm gonna have to go back to my videos to see the timeline, and on the final video edit I might throw up some dates just to outline which days and how many days apart some of these sessions were. But with someone who was confident and had a week and didn't have to go to work, I think a project like this could get from building the chassis, building the mold, thinking about how you put the and then what you'll see now is I started using builder's bog because that was part of the process that was shown with the guys that make the car modifications to house speakers. It's throw down the fabric, epoxy the fabric, add fiberglass for strength, epoxy that, and then just for something to smooth out all the bumps and dints in the epoxy and the fiberglass is to add builder's bog and then sand that back. This builder's bog mixes up with a fixer. The more fixer you put into it, the quicker this stuff sets. The less you put in, the slower it takes to set and go hard. So when you do a high or a fast setting mix, you can actually sand it, and it's probably best to sand it by about the half-hour mark to get the major chunks off that you need to get rid of, like maybe with a file or some kind of scraper if you have to. But yeah. At the end of this session, this case looked like a bit of a Frankenstein's monster situation, probably because of the flesh-coloured builder's bog. But yeah, from here on it's basically adding builder's bog and sanding until it gets smooth, because this stuff can be used on cars. I think Bondo is the official other product that you would use on a car, with this builder's bog stuff, by the time it got flat and thin, and I guess in the properties of this product, it is actually flexible. So once it's set, it's not like plaster of Paris that if you start to bend it, it would crack. This stuff actually has a bit of flex to it. So the fabric had flex to it after the epoxy was on, even after the fiberglass went on, and it also had a bit of flex to it because it was, you know, only 2 to 3, maybe 4 at most millimeters thick. And then adding this stuff went well with that because of the flex that it had. Here I'm just putting down some paint, probably just to, you know, get a uniform color happening so I could see where if there were any imperfections, and there were, and also just to get like a dust coat down. I think I also did it obviously just to start getting this thing to look like I wanted it to turn out, just to get some idea of how we were, you know, reaching the goal that I wanted to achieve. But as you can see, we just went with another thinner layer of fiberglass, which I think was very helpful, and you know, it got another layer of resin in there between the initial layers of epoxy with the fiberglass, the builder's bog that we added and sanded, and then this layer. With this layer, as we were putting it on, I thought this looks great. Like when it was wet, it was going on really nice, and I was like, this is smooth, this is great, I'm just going to paint it after this. But as you're about to see in a few seconds, after I kind of gave it a bit of a scuff sanding, you can see all the high and low parts. It was going to be nowhere near smooth. So basically I'll be adding more builder's bog and doing more sanding work. So in this case, the way that I made this mold, all I had to do was unscrew the top and bottom of that mount and just pull it out sideways, and that's actually how the computer case, as you see, is going to go in. So this was just testing to see that the measurements that I did were right, and that the case would actually fit in there and everything was aligned properly. Once the main mold supports were taken out, I had to put these two back in because it was a little bit squishy. The sides were just bulging out, and that obviously doesn't happen once the case is in there. Once the chassis is bolted into this outer casing, it's solid as a rock. So yep, just going with more builder's bog. This is actually a plastic primer. It's a primer filler, so it's meant to actually build up a bit of a layer that you can sand back to make something smooth. It's an automotive product. After the builder's bog, everything that I added to it new was an automotive product. So the grey paint is the primer filler, and then later on, when I started adding, or when I painted it with the final coat, it was a blue. It was like a touch-up paint from an auto shop of the warehouse type. And yeah, it's like a touch-up paint for your car, and hopefully the shade of blue would match your car. So I think it kind of hit on that whole GT color, and it was an automotive product, so an automotive paint. So at this point, I no longer used the sanding discs and this electric sander. I made a tool for sanding out of just a block of wood I think on one side I added a like 3mm or 1/4 inch of foam, and then super glued the sandpaper to it, and that was my flat sanding block from then on. One side had probably 250, 120, maybe 250 grit, and then the other side had more of a 400 grit, so a finer sanding pad. Especially once I got to this level of adding the primer filler, I was getting very close to having flatness and smoothness. So I would just sand that, find the imperfections. I think from this point on, if I added the builder's bog, it was only in a few places to fill some holes that I found. The big hole on the front is obviously where I put the panel, like a circular panel, to house the button, the power button, the reset button, the hard drive LED, and the power LED. Those were taken, the actual switches and the hardware and the button excuse me, the button and the power, all the hardware for that panel were taken from the original case that I cut down. So I guess it's just how I work, but I start these projects, I have no idea how long they're going to take me. A lot of the work is only done on weekends because I have a full-time job. Some of the work, as you saw, had to be done at my parents' house. So, it's all done in pieces. So I'd have to really do the math and look at the video footage and calculate in some of the parts that I did without the video camera running, to figure out how long this took. But I would to put a general figure on how long it took me was
7 months.
I'll do some maths and put some figures on the screen to confirm what at the moment I'm assuming. This project was done obviously a few years ago now. I've had this video in the can and edited, waiting for a narration like this for years. And because I recently, recorded me replacing the motherboard again, have some more footage to add to it. So I think this video is ready to go onto YouTube to finally share to everyone. I probably bought 4 cans of that builder's bog, and I probably bought 4 cans of this primer filler, and they weren't cheap. Fiberglass sheeting and epoxy resin, and then the original MDF. With all this in mind, I'm not sure how much this project cost, but with all the work I put into it, if anyone ever wanted to buy this from me, because it can pretty much house any computer from the future. The main limitation is the size of the graphics card that you choose to put in it, because of the shape. That's the one limitation. However, I have been able to put the smaller graphics cards, such as a 1050 NVIDIA 1050 Ti is what I currently have in it. Here's where I'm just making a modification to the riser for the hard drive, because it came in contact with the front of the case when I pushed the chassis into the case for the first time. And now that piece actually provides a bit of support at the front. If anyone were to ever push down on the front, that hard drive riser is actually keeping the front from collapsing. The whole time I was building this, I had no idea how I was actually going to bolt the chassis into the case. And in the end, I just used 4 nuts and bolts around the back from the bottom and from the top, and that seems to be enough to keep the chassis in there and does it well. So here's where I was installing some basically speaker covers that I think are designated for the inside of a car if you ever had to replace your speaker covers. When I first envisioned this, I thought I would put the speaker covers on the front, but I found that with the curvature of the front, I had nowhere to, and then the size of the front, especially because of the size of the centerpiece on the front, I had no room to put them on the front. So I put them on the sides, and they actually are basically where the fans go for cooling the chassis. And I decided, one side would blow air in, the other side would blow air out, and that would be the airflow of the case. Here I'm using the cutting tool again, just to follow the line I wanted. If you ever try to cut a circle, this is the best method to use, with the circular disc. So once the hole was cut, there was a little bit of filing and enlarging of the hole I had to do to make this cover fit in there. And then the last thing was to drill holes for the nuts and bolts that go through. So to mount the first fans that I put in there were actually 80 millimeter size fans, or in American imperial measurements, about 4, I think they're 4-inch fans. I actually had to put a plate in between this, so those 4 bolts went through to a plate where I had to cut a circle in the middle of the plate, obviously to let the air through, but that plate in reverse had the screws that went outward, or let's say inward, to hold the fans. So that plate would screw to the fans, and then once I push it into the body, I'd put the bolts through and it would hold all of it together. I don't think I've got any close-up video of that, but that's how I managed to mount the fans sturdily, by having a plate, basically an acrylic plastic plate in the middle. I used basically the same material I got for pick guards for my guitars that I make, and cut it out of that. But any 2mm ABS plastic sheets would do for that. So you can see here where I'm cutting back the back of the chassis to get it more fitting to the back of the case to make it more fitting to the chassis. This is when I've done the lid. I've already cut out the space in the top of the lid for where the acrylic's gonna show and go through. But the top actual outer shape here, you can see I'm sanding it back to meet the body. And I put all that I put all that gaffer tape and sticky tape on there so that the sanding disc, which was pretty rough because it had to shape the MDF, wouldn't harm the body, since I put so much work into that paint job and getting it smooth. So the lid is one really thick piece of MDF, and then there's a 3mm piece at the layer of the 3mm acrylic. I say 3mm, I'm pretty sure it was 6mm. And then the top piece again was another 6mm piece of MDF. So later on I found the cut I did could have been closer to the chassis once it was bolted in, so I made some more adjustments. That right there was the first version or a prototype of the front plate that would hold the power button, etc. I used the same plastic primer filler on this lid, just so I knew I could primer fill it, sand it smooth, so that the paint going on would have a very smooth surface to stick to. Obviously here's the application of the car paint. The spray can I bought was, I think, 600ml, and I think I ended up having to buy 2 cans. I pulled this tape off for the pinstriping possibly 5-10 minutes after the paint went on, just because I didn't want it to set permanently hard, because I didn't know how the paint peeling, the painter's tape coming off may have chipped the paint if it was dried completely. So didn't turn out, if you really get close to those lines, even today they don't look great, but from a distance looks okay. So this would be adding the clear coat to the lid and to the chassis. After painting so many guitars with a proper air gun, or painter's air gun, spray gun, whatever you want to call it, I got pretty good with how I should be laying down the clear coat with a spray can. First time I ever used a spray can on something, years before this, I used way too much and it just started running immediately. It's just something that comes with experience as to how to use these products properly and effectively. And even then, still a good effort, but right here where you're looking now, there was too much clear coat in that area, which ran down at a bit of a lip, or a massive, I call it a run, I guess, and it took a bit of the white paint under it with it, which was probably applied 24 hours earlier. So here we are putting it together for the first time. I installed this latch, like a magnetic latch, to hold the lid down. Gravity generally just holds the lid down, but I thought I'd add a magnet as well. every time I carry this case, it's in the same horizontal position. I never tip it up or turn it. So, you know, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be hard to install some kind of proper latch to keep the lid down, but with my application and this just sitting in front of a TV, didn't feel the need to really bolt the lid down. And with the light inside, I, you know, obviously wanted to show off the insides of this computer, even though it's not full of RGB. I don't think there's even one piece of RGB lighting strip or fan. I eat those words, because right now there's a fan in it that's got a red color to it, but initially there was no RGB or lighting on the fans. There you can see the fan. That one was an 80mm low profile fan that was really cheap, and it wasn't very strong, so I replaced it not long after. Right, there's, you see the demonstration of the fan. That's the back of the switch. That's the USB connector connecting that light to the internal power through the card. That's the, you can see there I ended up using a white perloid pickguard material for that front panel, and just on the back of it I super glued some metal pieces, and just behind it is the magnets that I screwed in to basically drilled some holes and threw the magnets into the holes, and they haven't budged. They haven't wanted to fall out of those holes because they're pretty tight. And that's how the front panel stays on. So here's a bit of a tear down when I had to replace the power supply. I painted that power supply blue. Loved the color because it matched the graphics card shroud that I painted, and it also matched the SSD that I painted. Again, just putting that etching primer, well actually I think that would have been that plastic primer filler, just a thin layer of that, and then I put the blue paint down, which I think was just an enamel paint, a cheap spray enamel paint from the automotive warehouse type shop. But yeah, so right now I've got a grey old HP power supply in there. It was very proprietary for the model of computer that came out of. It had not many power options coming off it. Like one power for an SSD, one Molex, one for a floppy drive, and then obviously the power for the main board and the CPU, but it didn't have any more sockets on it. So immediately I knew I was going to replace it. Mainly this was put in there just to test that was the fault with the computer at the time. So here's a video from probably a day later when I purchased a new power supply. It was fairly cheap. I think it's bronze level, and you can probably tell from the ketchup and mustard cords that, yeah, well, it's not a gamer grade type power supply. It just had to power the computer as a media PC. So even though it's a bit dusty, I did these final type showroom type shots of how it looks in the end. But yeah, we're now going to go on to showing you probably a very quick, fast, sped up highlight reel of the next time I had to replace the motherboard and chip, because that gigabyte motherboard eventually died a few weeks ago. It was just turning off randomly. It could have been a heating issue, but with the age of it, I was ready to let it retire, and got some I already had a motherboard and just had to get a second-hand chip and some RAM to get going again. So that's what you're seeing now. And then at the very end of this video, I'll show you what the whole setup looks like in my bedroom, where this media PC sits underneath an LED screen, or a 40-inch LED screen that I've got running in the bedroom. And just a side note for that, I'm renting the house that I live in, so I wasn't going to screw the TV mount to the wall, so I made a stand that would hold the TV wall mount and just get it up high enough so that we can see it from laying in bed for the Netflix and chill times. But yeah, I hope you got something out of this video. I hope it's inspired someone to at least modify or make or think about modifying a computer case into a style that they want with the materials that they want, or even to, once you see the videos of these guys doing the process where they're basically making car speaker mounts for the inside of cars at the very custom level, and how beautiful they can turn out if you look at some of the outcomes they get using the same methods. Hopefully some other people decide to make computer cases out of fiberglass, which can lead to some wonderful creations. I just haven't seen anyone bother so far online. Every time I put in a search for acrylic computer case or fiberglass computer case, it's all just acrylic sheets and boring clear plastic, which it shows off the internals of your computer and all the RGB that you got going on, and just sometimes it's cool to look at the internals of your computer, put them all on display, which I've kind of done in mine by having the clear lid. But yeah, with this actually lets you make something in whatever shape you want, given the molding method. Basically the shape could be anything that you want. Sky's the limit. So again, I hope I've inspired someone to look into doing that themselves. Be careful with all of the chemicals and products that you use, and make sure that you keep yourself safe. But otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed the video. This is not a guitar video. I've changed the name of my channel. I'll probably change the name of my channel again. It's no longer just guitar stuff this guy does. So I'm going through a bit of a naming crisis at the moment, but I'm not going anywhere, and I'll keep uploading videos of stuff that I've done that I think is great and I think you want to see. Until next time, have a bloody good one.